Alright, this fourth lecture is a lecture designed to give you guys a history of the field. It's just a big overview. It'll be a little bit longer than some of the first three lectures, but it's really important, some of the information that we're going to cover. So just quickly, I'll give you an outline for the lecture. We'll begin by talking about what is mass communication, how do we define it. I'll give you a definition that you'll need to know. We'll talk about what questions are important to the study of mass communication, and then we'll talk about the roots of mass communication research. So what defines mass communication? Well, one sentence definition that we can use for mass communication is that it's the large-scale distribution and reception process characterized by one-directional information flow, an impersonal source and an anonymous receiver, asymmetrical source-receiver association, a market exchange relationship, and standardized message content. So if we go back through and look at this definition, one of the first things you should key on is that it's large-scale distribution. Mass communication, because it's mass, means that it's aimed at large groups of individuals. It's not really clear when information becomes mass and when it's targeted toward a specific group of individuals. But if we think about some of the larger mass communication formats, such as films, books, magazines, we're talking about readerships and viewerships in the millions of users. So we're talking about large-scale distribution, not just targeted towards friends, such as YouTube videos, but targeted towards the general public. The second thing we should think about is that it's a one-directional information flow. When you send out mass communication, it's different from other forms of mediated communication in that the information only flows in one direction. It comes from the source and it flows out to the receiver. If you're thinking about this in terms of something like a conference call or Facebook, Facebook wouldn't really be considered mass communication because it's not one directional. People can comment back on posts, they can message each other, so it's a two-directional information flow there. Whereas mass communication is just one direction. If you think about a TV show, the producers of the TV show are just sending information out to the audience and they're not really receiving information back right away. Second or third, the impersonal source and the anonymous receiver. When you think about films, magazines, television shows, the source isn't really well known to the viewer. It comes from a large group of individuals, generally, the producers of the content. So the source isn't really known. It's impersonal. You might know a show on CBS, but CBS, you don't really know what that is or who that is. It's just this impersonal kind of organization. Also, the receivers are generally anonymous. So when you're sending out a mass communication message, you might not necessarily know who your audience is. You're sending it out and you're hoping maybe to target specific groups of individuals, but perhaps that doesn't happen. Either way, it will be kind of hard for you to figure out who those receivers are, so they tend to be anonymous. You're not targeting people individually. There's an asymmetrical source-receiver association here. This is really talking about the power structure that exists. When we think about the impersonal sources, the large mass communication media firms, we're talking about individuals or groups with lots of power, whereas the receiver has very little power in the relationship. There's a large number of them, and if they're well organized, they can sometimes influence organizations, media organizations, but generally the media organization has a lot more power in this relationship. Most of the media information is based on a market exchange relationship, so people are interested in how much money they can make off of these messages. If you think about a film, that's a really big industry. They cost lots of money, and they're designed to bring money back in. Television shows are the same way. Most print is like that. So most media is based on this market relationship. What can you earn for the content you produced? And then lastly, it's standardized message content. So when we think about mass communication, we're thinking about messages that are standardized. And that basically means that the messages are the same for everyone. It's not tailored to the receiver. It's not tailored to the person who's viewing the content. The message is the same no matter who is receiving it. And that's what we mean by standardized message content. So some of the major questions that are considered by the history of media effects research are: how does a society influence media? So how is it that society determines what occurs in the media? Also, how does mass communication occur? How are these processes done? And then also, how does exposure influence people? This is the real effects question. So what effect does media have on people? So just a food for thought type question you should think about throughout the lectures. Do you think that media exposure causes societal actions, meaning that the influence comes from the media and it influences society, or does society influence the media? Now, it's probably a mixture of both when you think about it, that media sometimes influences society, and other times society influences media, but a lot of times this relationship is not well defined, and it's something we need to think about, and it's something that is going to determine researchers' interests and what they're studying. So something to keep in mind: which direction does the power flow from? Does society determine what's in the media, or does the media determine what's in society? All right, so I want to just go through a couple of different approaches that have been used to study media research. These different approaches are not to be thought of as being one is right and one is wrong, but they're different paradigms that basically guide research, guide our way of thinking. So each one has its own assumptions built into it, and each one gives us a different view of the media landscape. So keep in mind that none of these are necessarily right or wrong. They're just different ways to think about the same process, which is media reception and media production. The first one is structural functionalism. Structural functionalism argues that the media helps maintain societal order. So when we think about structural functionalism, we're thinking about ways that the media helps society keep moving, and basically, how does the media oil the gears of society? We can think about news programs being part of this, in that news programs help people stay abreast of the information that's going on in the world, what's happening. We can think about entertainment being part of this, and that entertainment helps people relax and it keeps people kind of sane. But those are the kinds of ideas here, right? That the media is a structure within society and it helps maintain social order. It helps make sure that society keeps working and keeps moving. Evolutionary thought is another approach to studying media. Basically, this idea is that media consumption is a byproduct of our evolution. This is something we've talked about a little bit, or at least hinted at in the first couple of lectures when we talk about how information exchange has changed over time and the history of human communication. But the idea here is that media consumption is derived from our evolution. So when we think about animals at play, they play because they're learning specific skills. So if you think about a mother lion and her cubs, she can teach them things about hunting, and they learn about things about hunting through their play. People have considered media to be an example of this, that's basically humans at play. So whether it's we learn how to deal with other people by watching movies such as romantic comedies, right? We might learn how to deal with the opposite sex through our exposure to those films. We also might learn information through education, which is a formal form of learning, but also through things like playing video games, watching television, reading. All of these are kinds of forms of play within this evolutionary thought framework. Symbolic interactionism is another form of thinking about media. This basically correlates more to media as information transmission. So it looks at how people interpret media messages and then how they respond to the messages. I'll talk a little bit more about this later when we go through some of these ideas, but this one is basically just looking at information exchange. How do we interpret the messages that we see in the media, and then how do we respond to those messages? The last one is the cognitive paradigm, and this basically argues that people respond to perceptions. This one is more psychologically based than the other forms, or the other paradigms, but this one is basically looking at what is it about our psychology that influences how we respond to media. The cognitive paradigm is commonly used to study content exposure and effects. So we might look at specific forms of content and how we know people respond psychologically to that content. We might look at the psychological responses to exposure. And then we also might look at effects long term. This is largely a micro level paradigm. Remember I told you earlier to think about these different paradigms in being macro versus micro. Cognitive is mostly micro, so it's looking within an individual, not at society at large. If you think about the other paradigms that we just talked about, such as the structural functionalism, that's more of a macro type approach. It's looking at society at large and how the media influences society. The cognitive paradigm is more micro level. So it's looking at cognitive effects, attitudinal effects, behavioral effects, and physiological effects. So now that we briefly kind of introduced the topics and the different paradigms, we'll dive right into the historical evidence for media effects and the historical study of the field. This is going to respond or correlate with chapters 2 and 3 of the textbook. Over time, historians have documented concern over media effects before the scientific study actually took place. So for a long time, people have considered media to be specifically powerful. Whether that's the church, such as the Catholic Church, censoring information, Henry VIII censoring information in England, the Alien and Sedition Act in the US, which made it illegal for people to print information against the government. But there's been always concern over these things. So there's always been suppression of media content. Media has been seen as being a powerful tool for social action. And everyone is basically in power has looked at forms of curbing that by suppressing the publication of content, such as the church, Henry VIII, and even the American government and the Alien and Sedition Acts. There have been reports throughout history of mob violence over media content. You can look in the book, there's several examples of this. And there's always been kind of public concern for indecent material. From the early penny presses in the US, which published kind of pulp fiction type stories, to concern over pornography and its accessibility. But there's been a lot of public concern over indecent material. So what's acceptable to say within media and what's unacceptable to say within media. I just want to point out that a lot of these concerns date back to very early in human civilization, back to ancient Greece. Socrates was very concerned about what was in media content, what was in the stories that people were telling. So these historical concerns date back basically to the beginning of human civilization. In addition to concern, there's been historical evidence for changes due to new technologies. I talked about the printing press and how that changed basically society at large by increasing literacy and increasing the amount of information. There's been historical evidence due to persuasive messages. If you look at the Spanish-American War, that was largely influenced by William Randolph Hearst's newspapers. He's been credited with causing the war. There's been historical evidence for changes in public opinion, and then on fright reaction. So individuals seeing something in the media and it influencing them and causing large-scale fright reactions. We'll talk about one of the most famous ones later in this lecture, which is the War of the Worlds broadcast by Orson Welles. Now, before we begin talking about the field itself and how it was created, I want to talk a little bit about societal changes that led to the birth of the field. Prior to the 18th century, when we think about Western society, it was relatively traditional. There were close-knit families that lived together, there was a strong sense of community, and people didn't really stray too far from where they were born. Now, by the end of the 19th century, life was very different than previous. In the 19th century, we saw several trends that created societal changes and led to a modern society. The first one is industrialization. Now, industrialization led to new forms of production, which led to large increases in productivity. We saw the invention of the assembly line in industrialization. We saw steam-powered tools. So it basically led to the production and mass production of new jobs, new materials, and it allowed materials to spread faster and for more of them to be needed. So we see a trend towards industrialization. This industrialization led to urbanization, so we began to see people moving from the country to the city for new jobs and new opportunities. An interesting fact that I want to just throw out right now is that urbanization continued throughout the 20th century, and actually just a couple of years ago, for the first time in the history of the world, more people lived in urban areas than in rural areas. Basically from when humans first came on the scene evolutionarily 200,000 years ago, more people lived in rural areas than urban areas. Just recently, back in 2009, I believe, that switched, and now the majority of people actually live in cities. So urbanization was a trend that continued and is continuing, people moving from rural areas to large cities. And then we also see modernization taking place. We see advances in technology that greatly improve and change life. We see the invention of the standardized clock, which I talked about earlier in one of the lectures. And we see that basically the way people live is starting to change. People no longer are restricted in space. People can travel much easier. Jobs are more plentiful than they were. And basically the standard of life starts to increase all over the world. Much faster in Western societies, but even now continuing in second world and third world countries. Now, all these changes led to an idea called the mass society. Scientists, philosophers, etc., they became concerned with, due to industrialization, urbanization, and modernization, the idea of social differentiation, psychological and psychological isolation. Now, these two components are key concepts within the mass society idea. Mass society argues that social differentiation, that is, people begin to differentiate more. They start to spread out. They start to become different classes of individuals. You see the birth of the middle class. So you start to see more stratification within society. And you also start to see more psychological isolation, or at least this is what scientists and philosophers argued. That people become more psychologically isolated. We don't live in small groups anymore. We're starting to become anonymous individuals to our neighbors. And this leads to people feeling more isolated, or at least that was the thought at the time. So, in the 1920s mass society, we see that social differentiation increases. You start to see the working class versus managing class, so white collar, blue collar type differentiations, what Karl Marx would refer to as bourgeoisie and proletariat. So we start to see a social differentiation. We start to see ruling classes and underclasses. We also start to see informal social controls weaken. If there's anybody out there from a small town, you probably realize that there are a lot of informal social things that control people's behavior in small towns, things such as gossip. Well, when you don't know your neighbors, gossip becomes kind of irrelevant. So they argue that by living in large cities, informal social controls weaken. We're not influenced as much by our families, as much by our communities. Communication becomes more difficult, they argue, due to the fact that we start to see the 40-hour work week take place. We start to see people having jobs, having careers, not necessarily that are tied to their social life. We start to see a differentiation between social life and work life. So they argue that communication becomes more difficult due to this fact. Also, media become an important information source. Previously, important information sources tended to be societal institutions such as the church, the community itself. But with the production of mass communication, we start to see that those sources, such as churches and societal institutions, become less important and that the media becomes a more important source of information. This also leads to the idea that because of all these facts, because social differentiation has increased, because we no longer have the informal social controls, because communication has become more difficult, and because the media have become an important part of information, that we have this sense of anomie or normlessness. That is that whereas once we had very strong norms, those norms have ceased to exist due to all of these processes. We don't have community norms anymore. We don't have social norms as much as we once had. You can kind of see this in fashion. If you think about what was acceptable in the 19th century to wear, it's really completely unacceptable today and vice versa. The idea of jeans and a t-shirt would have been seen as completely foreign to people in the 19th century. So that's another kind of like loss of norms. We don't have norms with fashion anymore. You can pretty much wear whatever you want. So these are all ideas that come from mass society. Now the mass society concept led to this idea of the magic bullet theory. Now this is a perspective of much early research, and the magic bullet theory argues that media become very powerful sources for controlling individuals and shaping their behavior. The perspective argues that people are socially isolated. We've just been talking about that, how they live within their homes, they don't spend as much time in the community. People also have uniform instincts. This is an assumption of this magic bullet theory. Basically, that people respond similarly to similar situations. And they are not as influenced by their social ties. So the magic bullet theory argues that human nature and isolation lead to similar reception and interpretation processes. That is, because humans are relatively the same, and because we're isolated and not influenced by each other as much, we're going to receive information from the media in a similar way, and we're going to interpret it in a similar way. The magic bullet itself, the reason it's called a magic bullet, is that the media represent symbolic bullets that can strike every eye and ear, and that lead to direct, immediate, powerful, and uniform effects. So the magic bullet theory argues that media can get out there and hit everyone, basically. Everyone can receive that information, and that when those people receive it, the media will have a direct effect on them. It will be immediate, it will be powerful, and it will be uniform. So this idea basically argues that the media are very, very powerful sources of information and very, very powerful in shaping human behavior. Some of the early evidence on the magic bullet theory can be found in the pain-fun studies. This is the first major research project that examined media's influence on people. It was basically a series of studies commissioned to examine content, the audience for, and the effects of films on audiences. Here's just a quick image of someone during the pain-fun studies. Basically, the pain-fun studies came from societal concern over the effects of films. Films were a relatively new technology. They were very cheap at the time, and children could go to them during the day and expose themselves to the films. And people were concerned, well, what is the effect of seeing these stories? A lot of the stories were violent at the time, focusing on cowboys, etc. And people were kind of concerned, what is this doing to our children? Now, when we look at the results of the pain-fun studies, they don't really show uniform effects. Remember, uniform effects is something that the magic bullet theory argues should exist, that the media should cause the same effects in everyone. However, this isn't the case. Still, at the time, they were interpreted as being overall very strong. So many see the overall effect at the time as being very strong, and it was interpreted as evidence of the magic bullet theory. Now, I talked about fear reactions earlier. Now we've come to one of the most famous examples of fear reactions to media. This is the invasion from Mars. Back on October 30th, 1938, H.G. Wells' novel, The War of the Worlds, was rebroadcast by Orson Welles as a radio show. Now, the radio program itself modeled itself as kind of the first form of reality TV, except it was on the radio. So instead of having actors portray the War of the Worlds, the broadcast itself was portrayed as news bits breaking into a regularly scheduled program. So orchestras were very popular on the radio at the time, and basically the program starts off as an orchestra recording, and then a newscaster breaks in throughout the orchestra's recording and says, "We've just received word that aliens have basically landed on Earth." This causes a lot of fear in people because radio was very popular at the time, and it sounded very much like a real news broadcast. People were afraid that aliens had actually invaded Earth. You have to remember that this is a time when Hitler was invading nations in Europe, so invasion was largely on the minds of Americans, and people were concerned about this. So it seems kind of silly, but they interpreted the invasion from Mars as being real. This led to very real panics by people, people even threatening to commit suicide, people taking to the streets with pitchforks. It basically led to a lot of social disorder. So there were some central questions that came from this that researchers were interested in, and it's basically how many people were listening and how many of those people who listened were scared and why were they scared. So in 1940, the Cantrill Office of Radio Research releases a report that examines this event. About 12 million people heard the broadcast of War of the Worlds that night, but only about 2 million panicked or thought it was real. So out of the 12 million that listened to the War of the Worlds broadcast, only about 2 million panicked and thought it was real. They found that 5 factors influenced the fear. One was the dramatic excellence of the news broadcast, so it appeared to sound very much like a news broadcast. Radio was accepted as a vehicle for announcements at the time. It would be like today if someone broke into a TV program and it was just a news break and they said, "We've received word that something terrible has happened." So as in the same way that might scare people today, radio was acting as that at the time. They used experts in their broadcast, professors, individuals, etc., who would be considered experts in the field of astronomy, and they used real places. So it took place in New Jersey, and the fact that they used real places led to people being more frightened. However, the biggest factor determining whether people were scared or not was tuning in late. If you tuned in at the beginning of the program, there was a disclaimer that said, "What you're about to hear is a dramatic fiction." This was also played twice later in the broadcast. However, if you missed the first one, you probably didn't stick around for the later ones if you believed it was real. So people tuned in late and basically were led to believe that aliens had invaded Earth. Some examples of statements from this report. An individual said, "I believed the broadcast as soon as I heard the professor from Princeton and the officials in Washington." So that's that idea that the use of experts led to increased realism and led to fear reactions. "I knew it was awfully dangerous situation when all those military men were there and the Secretary of State spoke." Again, use of real people. And when he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, do not use Route 23, the use of a real location, that made me sure." So people were responding to this as if it were real. Now, the invasion from Mars. Overall, why was it significant? Well, it was used as evidence of powerful media effects. People saw individuals taking to the street, rioting, looting buildings, people threatening to commit suicide, and they said, you know what, that's a really powerful effect. If the media can get you to threaten to kill yourself, we probably should be concerned about it. However, not all viewers reacted the same, which leads us to believe that the uniform effects doesn't explain this type of research. So that magic bullet model, maybe it's not true. Maybe the media only have limited effects. Now, before we continue, I just want to mention I've placed a link on Angel that has a complete recording of the invasion from Mars. If you'd like to listen to it, please do. At least listen to a few minutes of it and kind of skip around so you can hear why people might have believed it was real. And you can get at least an idea of what the broadcast sounded like. Now, we'll move on to Chapter 3, which focuses on the historic scientific study of media effects. All of these early kinds of studies that I was talking about aren't really scientific studies. They're more surveys of media effects, just examinations, kind of cursory overviews. So we'll start talking about the scientific study now. Now, the established history of the field can be dated back to the 1920s with the magic bullet model. This was after World War I. Institutes for propaganda analysis were set up. Public opinion research was done, looking at the election results. So this is when research first starts beginning. And they're really concerned about propaganda and public opinion changes. This takes place from the 20s to the 40s. In the 40s, due to the fact that we stopped seeing uniform effects, or we never really did, people start to reinterpret how media might affect us. And they begin seeing it as a limited effect, that media doesn't really affect us very strongly. The Army research took place here. I'll talk about that later. People's choice studies, looking at elections again. And the effects of mass communication start to be examined. From the 60s to the 80s, the moderate effects kind of paradigm has taken over. And this argues that the media can be effective in certain areas, but only some of the time. And it's not necessarily particularly powerful or uniform, but it can shape or guide society. Here we'll look at agenda setting research, which focuses on how news media can determine what people think is important. The spiral of silence, how once a topic has been deemed touchy, it stops being discussed. And also dependency theory, and how people become dependent upon media. We'll talk about all these later in the semester. From the 80s on, we go into the realm of powerful effects. Now, people begin to argue that yes, the media can have powerful effects. However, it's in a limited context. Now, a revised history is that debate has always existed about effects. People have always considered media effects to be not necessarily uniform. So there have always been people basically on the other side of the argument. So while the magic bullet theory was the dominant paradigm for early media research, there were scientists and sociologists and psychologists that argued the opposite of the magic bullet theory. This led to the acknowledgement of early studies by psychologists and sociologists and a reevaluation of those studies. The classification of effect types and determinants informs our knowledge. That is, what we think about the media determines what we're going to study. So if I believe that the magic bullet theory or if the magic bullet theory guides research, that's going to determine what you're going to study and where you're going to look for effects. Some of the precursors of media effects research deals with newspapers and public opinion, so looking at the content of newspapers, looking at how public opinion shifts, looking at the effects of music. Some early research by musicians and musicologists looked at media effects, and then also the study of humor, which was largely examined by Freud, kind of precursed media effects research. Now, I want to move into talking about some pioneers in media effects research and what they're known for. I'll begin by talking about Carl Hovland, then I'll talk a little bit about Paul Lazarsfeld, Harold Laswell, and then Douglas Wapples. Now, these four men were relatively important in the early stages of media effects research. A lot of the research that they did took place between the 40s and the 60s, and they kind of shaped the field and the questions that we asked. Now, one of the big determinants of research and media effects research was World War II. World War II was an impetus for the scientific study of mass communication because there was a large emphasis on persuasion. How is it that we can influence people to be persuaded to take place in World War II? Now, at the time, Carl Hovland was at Yale, and he was given a task by the American government to basically come up with ways to convince Americans to want to go overseas and fight. When you think back on World War II, now it seems like that people were all uniform in their belief that we should be involved, but there was actually a lot of debate at the time in whether or not the U.S. should become involved in World War II. Even after Pearl Harbor, there was still difficulty convincing individuals in the U.S. to want to go overseas and fight, especially in Europe. You have to remember that at the time, many American citizens were straight over from Europe and had just come off the boat as immigrants. So people were trying to convince Italians to go back to Italy and kill other Italians, and people were trying to convince Germans to go back to Germany and kill Germans. It wasn't necessarily an easy task. So Carl Hovland started looking at one-sided versus two-sided messages. Which one should we use? Should we use a one-sided message to convince people, or should we use a two-sided message? Just as a quick example, a one-sided message would tell you that you should go back to Europe and fight for all of these reasons. A two-sided message would say, here are the reasons to go back to Europe and fight, but here are other reasons not to go back and fight. So a one-sided message presents only one side of an argument, and a two-sided message presents two sides of the argument. Carl Hovland was interested in trying to figure out which one of these was the most persuasive. Here's a picture of Carl Hovland. A lot of the research he did was on the effects of training films. Those training films were some of the examples that I was talking about in terms of how to convince people to go back. He would place either one-sided messages in those training films or two-sided messages. He also did experimental research on the media effects on attitude change, and he's credited with doing the first experiments in mass communication. That is, we'll talk about what an experiment is later next week, but basically looking at, in a very systematic way, how media can cause changes in people's attitudes. Here is Paul Lazarsfeld. He is credited with doing a lot of effects on radio research, specifically looking at news broadcasts and also soap operas, which were popular at the time. He came up with the idea of opinion leaders and a two-step flow model of media effects. Now, the opinion leaders that Paul Lazarsfeld came up with were designed to try to get around the idea of the magic bullet theory. Now remember, the magic bullet theory argues that media has really strong effects. Well, Paul Lazarsfeld said, yes it does, but only on opinion leaders, and in turn, opinion leaders have stronger effects on their friends and their family. This led to the two-step flow model of communication. So if we look here, we can see the mass media sending out messages in the form of these arrows. Now, the arrows hit the big circles, who are the opinion leaders. These, for example, might be individuals who are particularly knowledgeable among friend groups, or that are experts in one particular field. If you think of your friends, you might have a friend who's really fashionable, or you might have a friend that knows a lot about music. In turn, you might look to those individuals as being opinion leaders within those different realms. Maybe you're the opinion leader for your friends. Either way, the model argues that the mass media can affect those opinion leaders, and then those opinion leaders in turn send out those messages that they received from the mass media to their friends. A good example of this might be on Facebook. If you have any political friends on Facebook, you might see them sending out messages that they received from media organizations or sharing stories from media organizations. This is an example of how maybe an opinion leader might influence their other friends. Now, another researcher at the time was Harold Laswell. He came up with a 5-question model of media effects research, and this model basically guides the questions we ask. He says there's one sentence that can sum up all of media effects research, and that sentence is, who says what, to whom, through what channel, and with what effect. Now, all of the media can be found in this sentence. The first part, who says what, who refers to an organization, what refers to their content. To whom, that refers to the audience for the content. Through what channel, that refers to what channel that content is being sent out in. Is it a print channel or is it a visual channel? And with what effect. The effect can be considered cognitive, attitudinal, or behavioral, as we've discussed before. In addition to coming up with this question, Laswell also pointed out three important functions that mass media serves in society. If you think back to structural functionalism, which we talked about earlier in this lecture, Laswell points out three different functions that media can serve. First is surveillance of the environment, things such as news coverage, correlation of society's response to events in the environment. This has to do with public opinion, so what does the public think is an important thing to do? And transmission of cultural heritage, so educating the future on what we consider to be important. So these three functions, Laswell pointed out as being functions of mass communication. It's important to point out here that Laswell did not consider entertainment to be a function of media. Rather, he considered it to be a dysfunction. He argued that entertainment acted as a narcotic and caused people not to care as much and to be basically desensitized to information. Now, Douglas Wapples came along and he added some questions to Laswell's famous model of mass communication research. So that who says what to whom, through which channel, and with what effect, Wapples added the question, under what conditions? Now, those early research looked for immediate and direct effects. Wapples was more concerned with what conditions should we expect media to be an important factor in determining responses. So media can't always change our attitudes, our cognitions, and our behavior, but under some conditions it can. So for example, let's say you don't know a lot about a specific country. You've never been there and you don't know anyone who has ever been there. The media under that situation could influence your beliefs about that country. It could shape your idea of what that country looks like, what its people are like, etc. And it could even create stereotypes about that country. Now let's consider an idea where you actually know a lot about the country. Maybe you have family from there, or you have friends from there, and you visited that country. Under that situation, or under that condition, media might not influence your beliefs at all. And Wapples was curious as to what conditions were media effective, and under what conditions were media not effective. In addition to Wapples looking at different conditions, Wilbur Schramm focused on mediating effects of communication. So he looked at focusing on the different reactions that people have to the same media. So if you think about it, people can look at the same exact media, whether it's a book or a television show or a commercial, and have radically different reactions. Imagine a liberal watching an ad from Barack Obama. They might have a very strong positive reaction to that ad. However, a conservative watching that very same ad would probably have a very negative reaction. So people can have the same exact, people can be exposed to the same exact media message and still have really different reactions to that message. He also looked at this idea of selective exposure, selective perception, selective retention, and the social categories. So people expose themselves selectively to media. We don't just watch indiscriminately. For example, conservatives tend to selectively expose themselves to Fox News, whereas liberals tend to selectively expose themselves to MSNBC. People perceive messages differently. They selectively perceive information in the message. And then they selectively remember specific information from the message. We'll talk about this more when we get to selective exposure theory, but just know that Wilbur Schramm came up with these ideas. Now, as we move on, researchers begin to try to generalize about effects. Bernard Berelson was once asked, was media effective? And he came up with this statement that you can see below. He said, well, some communication on some issues, on some people, under some conditions have some effects. It's basically the biggest cop-out you've ever heard, right? So he's saying that, well, sometimes communication, under some situations, on some people can be effective. But this leads us to different questions we can ask. We can look at, well, what is the communication itself? What are the issues? What are the people? Who is the audience? What are the conditions? And what are the effects? So we began to break down these questions even more from the original who says what to whom, through which channel, and with what effects. In addition to trying to generalize, Joseph Clapper also tried to generalize. Joseph Clapper, according to him, he said that media are not necessary or a sufficient cause of change. So generally, media don't really cause change. They're not necessary and they're not sufficient. But when they are, typically mediating factors result in media being an agent of reinforcement rather than change. That is to say that media doesn't really change the way you think about the world, but it can reinforce the way you think about the world, and it can lead you to maintain or even strengthen your attitudes. Now, media effects regarding change do occur in certain residual situations, and when they do, two things are likely to occur. Either the mediating factors are inoperative, allowing direct mass media effects, or the mediating factors themselves impel change. We'll talk about this more next week when we talk about what is a mediating variable. But basically the idea here is that the media don't necessarily cause direct changes. They generally operate through a mediating factor, and we'll talk about what that is later. Now, the 1970s and beyond led to this idea of Albert Bandura's regarding observational learning and social learning theory. Bandura argued that we view media, and by what we view and the results of what we view can cause us to learn information. So just by witnessing things on television and witnessing the results of that information or those acts, that can change our behaviors and change our cognitions. Now, the final points of contention regarding the established history. We see inconsistencies during the magic bullet years, and those inconsistencies are the same during the limited effects years and the same during the powerful effects years. So there's always been inconsistencies with the governing paradigm or the governing assumptions. So the question becomes, how do we develop standard lines to demarcate powerful, moderate, or limited effects? What do we mean when we say the media has a powerful effect? What do we mean when we say the media has a moderate effect? So future research has been looking at trying to do these things. In addition, it's also trying to identify the circumstances and conditions or variables that account for media effects and other generalizations. So basically, we're trying to figure out what are the circumstances, what are the conditions under which media has powerful effects, moderate effects, or limited effects. Now, that brings us to the end of the lecture. It was a little bit longer. I encourage you to go back through. If there was anything that was unclear, send me an email. I'll try to answer those questions in a PowerPoint on Friday.